Hi, everyone. Welcome to another coffee chat with Castlehill. Today I'm joined by Dr. Guan Seng Khoo from Singapore, and thank you so much for joining late in the evening for yourself.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the topics that we've talked about in prior ESG podcasts is we've talked about analytics and the importance of analytics, both from a measurement perspective, measuring the KPIs that you've established as part of, your ESG program, but also the fact that those analytics or performing analysis really needs to be driving into those scenario areas where you look at non-standard risk activities or non-standard risk data and see how that's actually going to impact you. And Dr. Khoo, you've done a lot of work in that area, and so we wanted to make sure that we got you on the show. So would you be kind enough to give a little bit of a background on how you got into financial services from your science background and moving into that side?
Oh, thanks, Tim. Sure. Good day to everyone. My name is Gwen Singh. I'm from Singapore. Basically, I was a university professor back in the 90s, about 25 to 27 years ago. So I started off doing research in semiconductors using supercomputers to do molecular simulation of material science on surfaces of semiconductors. And then I extended it to use it for part of the environmental science course that I could develop with the other faculty members from biology, from chemistry, from geography, and things like that. So during the course of curating the program and teaching it, I came across a lot of modeling skills and using the data, whether it's geospatial data or satellite data, not the kind that you have today with the various information sources, but traditional sources, especially from satellite which were primarily used for forecasting the weather and things like that. All right, or measuring the ozone layer, the size of the ozone layer, and carbon dioxide and things like that. So that's how I got into environmental science, and I also published a nature guide for schools in Singapore on the flora and fauna with my students as well. Yeah.
That's fantastic, and it's a beautiful city, so it's
Thank you.
must have been a lot of fun taking the kids around and doing some of those pieces. So.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
So when we talk about non-standard analytics, well, let's step back for a second, right? One of the interesting aspects of the environment, social governance part of it is that, of course, there is no single standard across the world. There's no single standard in most countries. You have the asset management side of the world who are looking at some of those environmental factors more from a risk-weighted asset perspective. And then you have the governance and social activities. One of my favorite stories being that you have to be really careful in the social side of it, especially you never know what's going to actually set off some interesting repercussions.
Correct, correct.
So, how have you seen that evolve? Where is the global standard? Where are we going to go from here?
I think we recognize that today, from an investing perspective, there's no global beta or an index to benchmark to, right? So when there's no beta or when there's no benchmark index, it means that there's no clear minimum standards for how you would allocate capital or funds according to your E aspect, your S aspect, or your G aspect. That's number one. There's nothing to compare to. Number two, even if you are able to equally weight it, 33%, 33%, 33% to all these three factors, then what is your stock selection in terms of what is the quality of the environment that you think deserve that one third weightage and things like that. So there's no clarity at all, right? So because of that, most firms tend to adopt the simplest approach, which is convenient in the sense that they usually procure the information from an information service provider like MSCI or Morningstar or Refinitiv, Reuters, and things like that. However, the danger then is that they may be missing the trees from the forest, or the other way, vice versa, the forest from the individual trees. Because basically, most of the information service providers tend to focus on three areas: the financial impact, the environmental impact, and the social impact. But what they may miss in terms of the data is the approach that they have today by adopting the ratings from somebody else is to kind of guide them how to measure the environmental risk, especially, right? But we know that carbon dioxide emission, for example, it takes place on a global basis. It is very systemic. So the measurement and the metrics don't teach firms how to manage them, because we know how to roughly measure them, but without knowing how to manage them. So perhaps what is missing today is thinking of the losses. Like if you invest, you remember a Sharpe ratio or information ratio, where you divide the returns or profit by the risk, usually denoted by the standard deviation and or things like that. But what if you are able to measure the wastefulness of your activities, your business model? Then if you can come up with a additional pseudo Sharpe ratio metric like profit divided by waste, that provides the incentive to link the financial and environmental and social performance to kind of think about how to change your business model. Because if you stick to the current model, an Amazon or a large corporation like Microsoft can declare their climate targets without even changing their business model. So the idea is to make use of the ratings that you have today and augment it with something like a pseudo information ratio, which try to make the business model or economy more circular. Because if you assess a company by profit against the waste they produce, then it gives you an opportunity to the senior management to think about how they should redesign their business model and things like that. So that is one aspect that is possibly missed. So and if we are looking at carbon dioxide alone, just for example, as a common yardstick together with other environmental risk factors, then what else needs to be measured? What about the other greenhouse gas emission that cause temperature rise, right? Beyond carbon dioxide. How about the recycling activities of the asset or the instrument or the company that you are looking to invest in, right? What about their waste management? What about their water consumption? What about their power consumption? So if you take into account all these factors, then it gives you a better picture of the actual performance of the company, their ESG performance of the company, rather than just be, I won't use the word misled, but sometimes you may take an alternative approach by just looking at the three pillars: social, governance, and environmental from the financial impact but the linkage to managing them is not very clear. So those are some of the challenges, I would say.
So we need a new factor, the waste factor, which brings some of those things together, which would be an interesting. One of the contentions that I have is that ESG is a perspective of many risks that exist today. Right,
Yes, correct.
just a different perspective, and so it's interesting to think about coming up with new metrics or new analytics that are going to say you're looking at your overall waste quotient, like you just talked about, right, as a company, because there's a governance aspect, there's a social aspect, and of course an environmental aspect to each
Yeah,
of those things. And
correct,
like you
correct.
said, you can't be focused just on one carbon dioxide or your social standing or any of those pieces. You have to actually look at it across all of those pieces together, it feels, and that's very complicated.
But preferably if you can cover as comprehensive as all the SDG factors, the
Yep.
social development goals, that's very good. But you also don't want to overpopulate your factors. Otherwise, you might dilute the effect, right? So
Yeah.
that's the challenge. So the approach I mentioned is not new. I've read it somewhere before. So I must thank the author for suggesting it.
Yep, absolutely. So what kind of, you mentioned that we can't look at just the greenhouse gases per se, but when you're looking at environmental analytics, what kinds of analytics do you think are important?
Obviously, because climate is like, I don't want to use a negative connotation, but climate change and environmental impact is like cancer in the body. It is latent, by the time you realize that you have cancer or something like that, it's almost the last part. So that is the danger with something that is very latent, like climate change and the risk that may impact. So since there's so much uncertainty about its impact, because in between the manifestation of the outcome, there could be episodic events like natural catastrophe or whatever. The danger then is the transition will take very long. And because there's so much uncertainty, the most optimal method by which you assess the possible outcomes of this particular investment you made, whether it's ESG positive or not, is to perform scenario analysis based on the worst case, if possible, and the possible cases. So it's like you are investing in an option. You consider all the in the money cases and the out of the money cases. So with ESG, you have to consider both aspects, in the money and out of the money. And then if it is out of the money, you assess judgmentally with your fellow peers or whatever. If that is the worst case that can happen and it is very likely to happen, what should we be doing right now? Which should we be transforming the business? Should we be avoiding the business? Should we be enhancing the business in another direction, or diversifying from the environmental threats and things like that? So those are questions that would be specific to a particular firm or particular group of senior managers and things like that. But I guess the scenario gives you a chance to ponder the various options and things like that. Although you may not completely cover all the options, some are totally unknown. But then it's always better to be prepared than being reactive, I would say.
Just out of curiosity, have you seen any firm where they've been able to make that shift because of some of these analytics?
The closest I've seen, which was an early adopter of alternative data, including satellite data, was a Dutch company called Robeco. So I think they were quite a leader in that sense. But I think now the other firms are also trying to adopt the same approach, either by tying up with an information provider or acquiring an information provider. But from the corporate side, sometimes the so-called companies in the so-called dirty sector are the most advanced. They are, because they emit a lot of greenhouse gases, they are very advanced in terms of their, what I call their value chain carbon footprinting. Are you familiar? Value chain means your supply and demand chain. So they look at their original business upstream with their partners or providers or their procurers or whatever suppliers, and they also look downstream in terms of their employee taking flights for business meetings or whatever, and of course their own factories, refining center or whatever. So they actually tend to adopt a very comprehensive scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emission measurement. And very few firms are that advanced, especially in scope 3, which is the downstream uh, uh, carbon emission measurement, because the currently most disclosures by TCFD or whatever tend to make scope 1 and scope 2 compulsory, whereas scope 3 tends to be voluntary, although there's a drive to make it mandatory. So until it comes, most voluntary disclosure would imply that the soundness of the model, the detection, the measurement may not be as comprehensive or as granular. So that would be the challenge for most investment firms, when they are doing their ESG due diligence, which I'm not sure whether they do, because they ultimately depend on the ratings company to do it, right? So, but to me, I believe that because climate change is, and the impact is so long term, it is better to have a team which you can send to do the on the ground due diligence as well.
So we do a lot of business with that supply chain side of the world, the whole third party and counterparty piece of it. One of the interesting things that we're seeing is that different companies that used to do analysis of a company's technology footprint and say, is there a technology risk, a cyber risk, or some of those things, have actually been evolving into looking at using some of those publicly disclosed pieces of information and saying, okay, if you're supporting your infrastructure in the cloud or in some other product area, what is that impact on your overall ESG score, right? So there's a little bit of checking to go with that self-disclosure from some of those companies.
It's a good step, I mean.
Yeah. Yep. And it's the right place because those companies are already they're looking at some of that public information
Correct.
from that perspective.
Correct.
Um, but to your point, if companies aren't looking at those scenarios internally, if they don't have a team working on that analysis or doing some of those pieces, it's very challenging for them, I imagine.
Oh, yes. Even when I was in some institution, like especially in the regulated industry like banking, I was among the first person to be appointed the internal head of risk model validation. Because in the past, most of the banks, they hire the big four like PwC, Oliver Wyman to do the checks and model validation of their business and risk model. But some of the regulators, like the old FSA, which is the FZ, the Bank of England, the PRA, they decided that they don't want the banks to hire the external consultants. They want them to develop in-house an independent risk model validation team, so that there's no conflict of interest in terms of being paid the consultancies and things like that. So when I was doing it, I realized that the more independent you are, the more granular you can go, the more you can even challenge the management. So we're purchasing data and models from information service provider. The danger is that you depend on them, but you are paying them. So it's back to the problem of the old credit rating agencies and the securitization model prior to the 2008 crisis and the subprime crisis, right? So so that is the danger when you outsource your model development and validation or review. The other thing, of course, is that the expense of alternative data is so wide, especially in environmental risk management, that sometimes for different sectors you may have to curate a different selection of choices of data rather than just using wholesale all the available data. So unless you are a specialist in a certain sector or certain area, again, the granularity may be missing or the focus may be missing. So the danger that you may end up with some garbage data in and garbage data out as well. So, and I see to get to today, especially when the annual ratings of ESG are published, because it doesn't make sense to me in the sense that when you invest in say a wind farm where you have to be a power grid, you have to clear the land, you have to deforest the region to construct the turbines, the wind turbines and all that. So that project to develop not just a wind farm and other infrastructure or other private assets like real estate or agriculture require you to kind of penalize the environment for a while, because you are removing a lot of the carbon reducing natural mechanism, right? So you would be ESG negative for a while. And typically such construction and development may take over a year to several years, depending on the delays or whatever. So if you issue your ratings every year, to me, it doesn't make sense. There will be a J curve effect in some of the projects. So, but that comes from understanding what implementing green technologies is about, or a green approach to investment. If the portfolio managers don't have that deep knowledge, so the danger is that they may miss the trees for the forest and vice versa. Yeah.
Yep. So the time frame for some of these analytics has to by nature be longer, right, than
Yes.
many
Correct.
other situations, right? It's not
Correct.
just about building a new mall, right,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something.
Correct.
It's the fact that the 3 years of planning before it got built, the actual destruction of the land that it was on, all of the construction associated with it. So it's a much longer tail that's going to be actually applied to that analytic from that perspective. You mentioned the Bank of England, and I have we look a lot at the Bank of England from a regulatory and from a even just from a paper perspective, because they do seem to have a strong interest in the ESG side of it. They've been in the
Yes.
financial services. They've led a lot of the other global regulator type things, and moving it forward. They're a little ahead of Basel. They're ahead of the U.S. They're ahead of the EU. in what some of the things they've done. Are you seeing any other areas in Singapore or other spots where they're really driving some of those types of regulations?
Probably in the area of digital. So, but in terms of environment, I think the European regulators are ahead and more advanced. The US could have been ahead, but because of the your different political regime then, so that was a challenge. But I would say that within North America, I think the Canadians are more advanced in that sense. But in Europe, I think Europe is the leader. Whereas in Asia, I think because of the nature of the unbanked economy among the emerging markets, like like a large market like Indonesia or Vietnam, Indochina, or even China and India itself, the digital acceptability of mobile devices, especially, is very rapid, and messaging is very pervasive and ubiquitous. So I think the more focus goes into the digital aspect. So I think the in terms of digital regulations, I won't be surprised if some Asian regulators are more ahead than some of those in the developed economies. Yeah, for certain aspect, you know, like payments or whatever, things like that.
It would be nice. There is some collaboration that seems to be happening across the world on some of the regulatory areas. It would be good if we can continue that or accelerate that somewhat.
Yeah, but
So,
I mentioned the Bank of England because my role as the head of model validation was with a global British bank. So I had to visit London to meet the FSA then. It used to be called the Financial Services Authority. Yeah, correct.
well, I think really the other area that they really have led, whether intentionally or not, is the accountability aspect that they've put into some of the recent, right? So the whole, the fact that as a director of one of those banks, to your past experience, you are accountable for that information being correct, not just saying, oh well, the guy in the back office didn't get it right, or the person who is doing the work didn't get it. It's no, you are accountable for it,
Yeah,
which,
but often I'm the scapegoat because I have to defend the bank section.
yep.
Yeah.
But it's much better governance that way to have some of that accountability. Do you see any data providers that are governments? When you look at sort of the wholesale data provider market for environmental information, is it private companies? Is it governments? In the U.S., there's a lot from some of the government agencies, but I don't know across where you're seeing that data come from.
I think it is very difficult because different firms specialize in different sorts of data. But usually, what I like is the arrangement among some of the global institutions with, say, a multilateral body like the United Nations. The United Nations. So you have the UNEP, United Nations uh, Planning and or UNEP
Environmental planning program?
environmental,
Yeah.
yeah, their planning group. They
Yep.
actually do a lot of projects with consortium of banks and consultancies, and I think that provides direct benefits because first of all, the it is idiosyncratic to the banking sector, the financial services sector, but there's a lot of implications for the general financial services sector, including asset managers and the insurance firms. Secondly, because they are more regulated from the banking sector, the requirements for doing the due diligence is more granular and more specific. So, like, let's say you're looking at the mortgage loan business. So you're purchasing a home in Miami or in the key, one of the cities where the one building just toppled. That was Miami, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But even before the building toppled, unfortunately, amen, um, they were facing the threat of rising sea levels, right? So that means the valuation of communities next to the waterfront or seafront tend to be affected slightly. And you notice it from research that uh, usually houses or homes in Miami can be valued less than those that are in the interior or something like that because of that threat. But if you apply in a model with a very clear model governance, then the chances are you are then able to kind of impose the climate risk premium into the pricing of your products, which makes that means the institution understand the investment or the financing, where you your approach is risk-based. When you have a ecosystem, ESG, risk-based kind of pricing, that is actually good for the future, especially if your assets you invest into, like the mortgages or the real assets we invest in infrastructure, tend to be longer term. Then you are able to then think about your liquidity risk as well, because you tend to be financed short term for the banks. Some of your investors in a fund like Neil Woodford in the UK, during a situation of panic, some of their investors tried to redeem the funds, but it was gated. So those kind of things could happen that may affect your investment. So if you price in the risk with a pricing based on the ESG, that actually helps to manage your climate risk in a more optimal way. I don't see enough of such green premium being imposed, except probably in the issuance of green bonds for the moment. But usually, even in the issuance of green bonds, if they are supposed to be ESG friendly, by right, they deserve a discount. But in some markets today, they are charged a premium, which is a bit uh, contrary to the risk that is,
Right.
yeah,
Yep.
the
The
risk
factors that are
reduction. Yeah,
there.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yep.
even the economic models in terms of pricing or valuation, there's a lot of room for assessment and improvement, I think.
Yeah. Some populism thrown into it
Yeah,
as well.
correct. Yeah.
Fortunately.
Yeah.
So I know we're just about running out of time. If there was one big takeaway that you wanted to tell people, what would the big takeaway be when thinking about data and environmental aspects of the ESG?
I think it has to be a collaborative issue, because climate risk is systemic, like what I say. In fact, I would call it ecosystemic in an ecosystem. And if you think in terms of the human society, right, why we can inhabit the Earth instead of Mars or Venus or whatever is because the environment suits us, our bodily functions, our hormones or whatever. If too high a temperature, we can't survive. So the first thing is sustainability in that sense. So if you look at an ESG investment, the main thing is you want to invest in a company that is resilient or sustainable to various external challenges, because the environment is key to it. And like what Charles Darwin had mentioned before, if you can't adapt, you obviously will die away. So the longer you assess the longevity of a particular business, the better your investment in that sense. And a lot of it is environmental related. How it's done, it depends on each individual firm's approach and governance and risk appetite, I guess. Yeah. So that's about what I can say for the moment. Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us, and I appreciate especially the time difference. So again, have a great day, and
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And have
Thank
a
you.
nice day yourself.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode of Coffee Chat with Castlehill. For more episodes, insights, and discussion, check us out on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or at our website, www.castlehillrisk.com. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll see you next time on a Coffee Chat with Castlehill.